how were the draft dodgers, the resistors, the conscientious objectors treated by the population at large, and how many were there? And I imagine, just based on the power of that Uncle Sam image, that and all of the emotions, power, sort of latent anger in the figure, that the reaction is pretty strong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The term at the time for a draft dodger, I mean, they used the phrase draft dodger, but the more common term used at the time was slacker, which is sort of a great word to describe someone who has not done his job, right? Not fulfilled his obligation as a citizen. And it became very clear that given the incomplete nature of draft registration, right, given how hard it was to track everyone down, that there were going to be slackers, right? And this is where I came across something I had never known about before I wrote the book, and this amazing phenomenon called the slacker raid. And a volunteer organization, the American Protective League, set itself up as a kind of volunteer arm of the U.S. Department of Justice, and would basically, sort of go around and sort of track down individual draft dodgers, sometimes by actually just, sort of doing sweeps, massive dragnets in cities and towns across the country, basically stopping everyone who looked like a draft age man and asking to see his draft registration card. And the law did require you to if you had to register, to register and to carry the card with you at all times. And so, starting in early 1918 and going all the way through until the very last days of the war, the American Protective League is showing up at movie theaters. They're showing up in subway stations. They're showing up at baseball games. Sort of basically surrounding a place and stopping and interrogating every man of draft age. And that very quickly sent a message, right? That simply evading the draft by not registering was going to be hard. But it also shows, I think, the crucial role of individual volunteers in doing the work of the law.
Yeah, this is something that I wanted to ask you about, because today, with the exception of isolated instances that make the news, I don't think of self-policing as being a major force in domestic law enforcement. But it seems like this was very different in the time of World War I. So just how was it different? Was there no, I guess we don't have a national police force now, but so what was the landscape like back then?
Yeah, so I think it's a crucial part of the puzzle for understanding, how the U.S. home front during World War I was policed. And the answer is it was not always policed by police. That you have a longstanding tradition of self-policing and in communities, and we have memories of some of this in our language, right? The idea of a citizen's arrest, right, that empowers individuals to arrest others when crimes are being committed. We might also think of the phrase hue and cry, right? If you raise the hue and cry. So, for example, from old movies, you would hear someone shout the word "Stop, thief," right? And that would have obliged able-bodied men to participate in capturing that thief, right, in a community where there's not a professional police force. And in the 19th century, into the early 20th century, those traditions, those practices would have been known and familiar to people. They were being displaced in communities that had professional police forces. And, there was an emerging modern sense that, like, look, we're an urban society. Policing it's a job, it's a profession, it requires training and technology. weapons, new things like fingerprinting and so forth. So this old way of doing things was definitely on its way out. But it persisted. In those kinds of ways. It persisted, particularly when it would enforce social inequalities, when it enforced Jim Crow through enforcing the color line, through racial violence and lynching, and it never actually went away. Right, and by some measures, in the 21st century, we have we still have plenty of community policing. Neighborhood watch organizations, so-called stand your ground laws are informed by the idea of community policing, and so it certainly hasn't gone away, and in some ways has reemerged as a complement to professional police forces.
Right, and not that today the police forces are pristine and perfect enforcers of the law, but going into some more specifics of what you were just referencing, how did racism or prejudice against other ethnicities or classism manifest itself during World War I in these citizen police forces, for lack of a better way of describing them? And which groups were persecuted and why, and how or when was it actually directly connected to what was going on with World War I?
Yeah, it's complicated because for many people who were not going off to Europe to fight in the war, one of the things that they felt obliged to do, that they felt very committed to doing, was to supporting the war effort at home, and so basically a big chunk of sort of men over the age of 45, over the draft age, or exempt in other ways, take it upon themselves to participate in various forms of what they would have called vigilance, what they would have called home defense, but that we might also call vigilantism, right? And it's a very blurry line between those things over the course of the war. For some, the other thing that's very blurry is a word that you see everywhere during the First World War, this phrase pro-German. And pro-German is a very slippery concept. There were, of course, a small number of people who did actually advocate for Germany, but very few. But more often than not, the phrase pro-German is used to criticize someone who seems to be standing in the way of the war effort, or even just challenging the status quo. So striking workers were called pro-Germans and would have found themselves, under the eye of these organizations. African Americans who are either advocating for their rights or even simply moving away in the Great Migration to places like Chicago or New York might have been called pro-German. Women suffragists, right, were even sort of called pro-German for challenging the status quo, and that's really, it gives a green light to these vigilance organizations to take things far beyond the war effort itself.
Mm-hmm. And you said that those who didn't go to war felt obligated to participate in the war effort, and I was struck by this as I was reading. But I suppose it's sort of a natural response of their masculinity that this would turn violent, because I imagine people felt emasculated by not being able to participate in the violence and the valor abroad. And I'm wondering if there were any particularly egregious acts of violence or other hate crimes at home during the war. So I saw that one of them had to do with Liberty loans, which you mentioned earlier, one instance there.
So, frankly, violence is rampant on the home front during the war in ways that I think would really kind of shock us. And especially as you read just newspapers every day over the course of 1918, it's pervasive in communities all across the country. Some of it is sort of targeted at at people who are sort of not towing the line, and people who are not registering for the draft, people who are challenging the war in some way, who refuse to buy bonds, who criticize the war effort or criticize the federal government. Often, those who are taking kind of left positions that this was, socialist positions that this was a rich man's war, that it was, a capitalist war, might find themselves, intimidated. They could find themselves, literally sort of dragged through the streets of town, sometimes subjected to tar and feathering, various instances of humiliation. We know, and I don't think we'll ever have a really good count, but probably at least 50 and maybe as high as 100 people are actually killed in incidents of violence during the war. The majority of those are African American. So often white Americans might find themselves targeted in very public and humiliating sort of ways, made to kiss the flag, sometimes even shaved, other kinds of things that might also maybe target their masculinity. African Americans might, because there is already a practice of racial violence, deadly racial violence against African Americans, are more frequently the fatal victims of violence.
Well, two things. One, I'll just start with the first one. Being tarred and feathered. I think most people, if they've ever seen it happen, it's been in like a Bugs Bunny cartoon where it's kind of a playful gag. But am I right? I mean, you've read much more about this than I ever have. It's actually like it could be lethal, right? It's very...
Yes, it's extremely painful. The tar or any other substance. I actually once encountered it being done with molasses, but that's painful. The feathering part is humiliating, which is psychologically painful. It's traumatic.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned earlier this anti-German sentiment that was very strong, but I'm surprised that you haven't mentioned an anti-communist sentiment. So I'm wondering if the Red Scare at all was important here, and then even to the formation of this national identity that was also happening at the same time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it kind of evolves over the course of the war, right? So certainly there is, before the First World War, there is a strong sort of socialist party in the United States. It's not huge, but strong. There are labor movements, both, kind of conservative ones and more radical ones. And when the war comes, sort of labor activism and socialist politics are both both targeted as anti-war and subject to suppression, particularly when those left movements are actually challenging the war, right? So, the Socialist Party of America is the only socialist party in the world that actually doesn't support its national war effort, right? The European socialist parties generally, did support the war effort in their countries. That changes over the course of the war, right? As the politics change, as the Russian Revolution emerges, and so by the time you get to the post-war Red Scare in 1919, there is a real concern that of a kind of a threat from socialist movements and communist movements. And also there is now this apparatus, the one that has been used to sort of target anti-war voices, is now very easily turned against anti-capitalist voices after the war.